I think it's more like Yul Brynner. Just a minute. What is the missing?
We are live now.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I welcome you all, the eminent faculty members and the residents and participants in this webisode. So this is a continuation of discussion on pancreatic and periampullary cancers. And we have now reached towards the borderline resectable pancreatic cancer. So we have Dr. Shikhande, Dr. Sandeep Jain, Dr. Sarupa, Dr. Dipanjan, and Dr. Kishore as our eminent faculty members, and who happen to be examiners in the your faculty and examiners. All of the residents know them well, so there is no need of formal introduction. So in the matter of time, we start with our session today. So I welcome Dr. Shikhande to have a lecture on the borderline pancreatic cancers, principles and practices. So please, I welcome you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can I begin?
Yes, sir, please. Yeah. So you need to share your screen, sir, and then we start off.
I will do that.
Right, right.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, we can see.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to the team at Max and all of you. Good to see you all. I periodically keep on interacting and meeting with you, but we meet virtually now. I'm very happy to be a part of this teaching concept. And the brief given to me is to focus on borderline resectable pancreas cancer. So when I select a patient for pancreatic resection, not just for the right pancreas for a Whipple, but even for the left pancreas, the key is to define the local extent of the tumor and to preoperatively, I would say radiologically, stage the disease. A simple case in point is here on the left side. You see that there is a dilated pancreatic duct. You see that you have a portal vein and a superior mesenteric vein. And you can also see the splenic vein. And what you are able to see here is that there is a big dilated common bile duct, a dilated pancreatic duct. The superior mesenteric artery is okay. There is no lymph nodes around in the retroperitoneum. The liver is looking clean. In such a case, this is plain, simple, resectable disease without vascular involvement. On the other hand, you see a tumor here which is completely encasing 360 degrees the retroperitoneal vasculature. The disease has gone right down to the aorta. There is a large mass. There is an atrophic pancreatic part which is dilated expectedly, and rightly so, the patient has got a metal stent to drain obstructive jaundice. Such a patient almost never, I would say in about 70 to 80% of the cases, would never come up for a worthwhile oncologic resection. And this would be the other end of the spectrum, and that's unresectable, locally advanced pancreatic cancer. So locally advanced is a word which has to be used carefully in the era of modern multidisciplinary care. And this is locally advanced unresectable, and the other end is straightforward resectable. And that comes to the category after that, which is the in-between category. And this is where you have tumors which are not locally advanced unresectable, which are not straightforward resectable. In this picture, a case in point, you see about 142 degrees angle of contact. You see the fuzzy planes. You see a tumor with stranding around. You see hypoechoic area. You see collateral formation. And you know that you are dealing with a disease which is a borderline resectable disease. And here we need to understand three entities. And those entities are circumferential contact with important vasculature. Also, we need to be very clear about length of contact, that is LC, and also need to be very clear about venous deformity. So when we speak of any disease which is more than resectable, I would say that we must pay attention to the superior mesenteric vein, portal vein, superior mesenteric artery, and as you go to tumors of the pancreatic neck and body, you must also be fully aware of the celiac axis, the associated arterial variations, as well as the disease in contact with the celiac, common hepatic, gastroduodenal. So all these blood vessels with a good triphasic CT scan, you will be able to study. So which is the commonest investigation that I would do to evaluate a pancreatic tumor? I would just do a well-done pancreatic protocol triphasic CT scan of the abdomen and pelvis. I would also do a CT thorax to complete a part of staging. Routine um, PET scan is not a must, but I will come to the ABC classification. And if you have any concerns, you can always do a PET scan as well. Some people would not do a CT scan and they would do an MR. This is very individual dependent. If there are specialized units which feel very comfortable with an all-in-one MRI, then I would say MRI with MRCP is as good as a CT scan. They are rarely complementary unless you are looking specifically for ductal anatomy with associated IPMN, etc., that I would add an MRCP to a CT scan, which is already well done. I do need an EUS in many of these tumors. The simple reason is that a large number of borderline resectable tumors would need neoadjuvant treatment in the form of chemotherapy predominantly, and in some cases, chemoradiotherapy as well. So we need a tissue diagnosis and you need an EUS as well. And of course, in borderline resectable pancreatic cancer, I think a PET scan is also worthwhile to rule out distant metastatic disease. This is an old publication, but the practice hasn't changed after this systematic review that we published in 2012. But if you want to do these difficult tumors, as surgeons, we need to understand that you need to sweat in peacetime if you don't want to bleed in wartime. So peacetime means operating on simple, straightforward, non-vascular pancreatic resections. But even while doing those straightforward resections, you need to be aware as to how you can access the superior mesenteric artery. I was already doing 7-8 years of pancreatic surgery when I undertook a week's visit for my own learning 11 years ago back to Heidelberg, just to understand the superior mesenteric artery better. Mind you, this was on a background of already more than 100 independently done Whipple resections. But even then, I took this time out and I think it has helped me a lot, as I will share with you. We looked at the superior mesenteric artery first, combined it with an uncinate first approach, which is what we have been doing in Tata Memorial for many years. And some of you have seen us do this. And then we compared it with the infracolic approach with the supracolic or the right medial approach. Not necessarily in all cases which required a vein resection, but even in simple cases. Because if you don't know how to expose and be close to the superior mesenteric artery, you will not be able to do vascular resections as you move ahead in borderline resectable disease. The other concept, apart from the picture which I've shown you earlier on the left side, is this picture. This is the concept of the levels of mesopancreas dissection. LV1, the 3 black lines is what I want you to concentrate on. LV1 is the conventional plane when you are doing a resectable tumor. LV2 would be the one when you are dealing with vein involvement. And LV3 would be the one which is the extreme end of borderline resectable or the early part of locally advanced, where you go subadventitial to the SMA and then come out infracolically to make sure that all this retroperitoneal tissue also comes out. This is important as we strive for R0 resections, which are now possible thanks to modern chemotherapy. And the game changer has been obviously modified FOLFIRINOX since it's come into the adjuvant platform a few years ago in management of pancreatic cancer. So this is an example where you see it's a very old slide of more than 10 years, but it's easy to explain. There is a window in the transverse mesocolon. The pancreas is lifted up in the yellow tape. The superior mesenteric artery is dissected beforehand infracolically and looped up in the orange tape. The vein is involved by a large tumor, but the uncinate process that goes behind the vein is a normal, simple, soft uncinate process. So I work LV2 here and then come on to the artery. So at the end, I have the SMA first transmesocolic approach, and I have the LV3 approach, where you can see I completely went into the subadventitial plane, got the artery dissected. There was a repair which had to be done of the vein, and then we could get a complete resection for a large pancreatic tumor. So in this picture, you see the next phase of development in borderline resectable disease, and that's a vein resection. You see an SMA first approach. The SMA is completely free. I've got control over the splenic vein, portal vein, right hepatic artery, left hepatic artery, and the superior mesenteric vein. Tumor hanging only on the vein. Tumor removed. A single 5-0 running suture of round body Prolene is used. In exactly 12 minutes or so, we would release the inferior clamp, allow the anastomosis to stretch with a growth factor, then release the superior clamp, and without any luminal compromise, you will have a type 3 ISGPS vein resection. So something which 12 years ago would look an intimidating operation is today the routine, because with neoadjuvant treatment, we are clearly treating more cases than ever before of borderline resectable pancreas cancer. But it's not only about surgery. Here you see a tumor involving the vein, partly. I do an SMA first and I'm a happy surgeon because I get a complete resection. I get a bigger tumor and I'm still a happy surgeon. I still get a free margin and I get a complete resection. Now, this is where surgeons need to start thinking beyond their surgical skills when you have more than 180-degree involvement of the vein. Because when you have more than 180-degree involvement of the vein, the retroperitoneal extent as well as the SMA is very close. You might get a SMA first, but you are very likely going to have an R1 resection. It's also important to know what Nakao, a foremost vascular surgeon from Japan, published in 2007. The highlight in red shows you the bad vein obstructions. They get collateral formation. You might do a good resection, but prognostically, as far as long-term outcomes are concerned, they don't do very well for an aggressive and systemic cancer like pancreas cancer. And we have looked at the same with our own data, with our dedicated pathology team at the Tata Memorial. This is more than 160, I think 181 cases, looking at our R1 rates following Whipple resection and comparing it with the tumor epicenter. Even in pancreatic head cancer, it's 57%, which is in keeping with what you see all over the world. But even for bile duct cancer, it is 20%. And the ampullary tumors, which we would do more often in our country, the apparently smaller tumors, the tumors with a better biology is what we think. Even 7% of them, on table, everything looks clean and nice, but my pathologist can come back and say that it was R1 resection reflecting aggressive tumor biology. So SMA first is helping me. This is low quality data that is published all over the world, and we managed to put together a meta-analysis looking at 771 SMA first versus 701 standard Whipples. And still, we saw, maybe it's not a direct outcome of SMA first, but we saw reduced morbidity and less fistula. That can be due to locally advanced disease and borderline resectable disease. The rates of pancreatic fistula and pancreatic head and uncinate process tumors is anyway low as compared to ampullary tumors. But there is a chance of a higher R0 rate and a tendency towards better survival also. So surgical technique and skill and experience is clearly important without doubt, but we need to move on further beyond the surgical skills. And what I've shown you in this picture is our conventional understanding of, as I showed you, what is resectable, what is locally advanced and unresectable, and what's borderline resectable. But now you have a situation where we convert many of borderline resectables into resectables, and many of locally advanced unresectables into borderline resectables. And this is thanks to chemotherapy. But it's not only about anatomy and response to chemotherapy. You need to factor in three things. And I would draw your attention to this good paper in 2018. And that's looking at anatomy, biology, and condition. So anatomy is the anatomy criteria which I spoke to you about. Biology would be you suspect, but you don't have proven metastatic disease, or the CA 19-9 is more than 500 units. And conditional criteria would mean the patient's performance status or the ECOG status that would preclude major surgery or that would alert you. So don't look only at radiology and anatomy, don't look only at biology, don't look only at the patient, look at everything put together, and that constitutes borderline resectable pancreatic cancer for an individual patient. For example, good anatomy criteria, but bad biology and bad conditions is perhaps not even borderline resectable. It is advanced pancreatic cancer and surgery may not be an option at all. I spoke to you about FOLFIRINOX and you see why, because this is the landmark publication. It came in 2011 as palliative chemotherapy in stage 4 pancreas cancer. Since then, in the last 2.5 years, it has evolved to adjuvant treatment. And the reason is you get a median overall survival of 54 months as compared to the long-standing gemcitabine, which was 35 months. But there were two lessons that we learned from this particular trial. And the lessons were very important. Here you see the Kaplan-Meiers, and you see that adjuvant FOLFIRINOX demonstrates a biological effect, indicating that even after doing surgery first, there is microscopic disease on which chemotherapy is working. So it's a systemic cancer even after good resection. On the other hand, the other thing that we need to understand is even after apparently successful surgery, concentrate here, there is an early fall off in survival due to death from disease progression in patients treated with upfront surgery. So that means the disease is there all along, and even after good surgery, there is disease progression. Does it mean that all of the patients need to be treated with neoadjuvant because it's a systemic disease? The answer is no. If you complete all the 6 cycles of chemotherapy, Juan Vale has clearly shown you that you can get good survival. But the big word here in this line is if completed adjuvant therapy. The minute you complete anywhere between 1 to 5 cycles, things start to become bad in the adjuvant setting. So you need to do good quality, clean, safe surgery and complete all cycles of chemo if you want to have a chance at long-term survival. But what's the clinical reality for a difficult surgery like pancreatic resection? Up to 50% or more of patients fail to receive adjuvant treatment, either due to post-op complications, which would be about 30% in the best of hands, disease recurring early, like early metastatic disease, post-surgery patient's performance status is not good, or there are associated comorbidities which prevent giving adjuvant chemotherapy. Which brings us to the thought process, why not treat everyone with neoadjuvant intent for borderline resectable cancer? There have been multiple studies by Tang in pancreatology in 2016 and another one by the Dutch group in 2018 in British Journal of Surgery. But I've cited to you the one which is more recent. And it looks at 24 studies, 8 prospective, 16 retrospective, over 300 borderline resectable patients. And you can see that there is a 67.8% resection rate, a high R0 resection rate, and a very acceptable median survival for neoadjuvant patients who then get surgery after neoadjuvant treatment. So clearly you have benefits of giving neoadjuvant FOLFIRINOX specifically. I'm not just talking of any neoadjuvant, I'm speaking of neoadjuvant FOLFIRINOX. You do lose anywhere between 15 to 20% patients in the neoadjuvant setting who may not come up for surgery because of disease progression and other factors. This is a fact, but this is pushing for selecting patients who deserve surgery as morbid and as major as pancreatic cancer resectional surgery. There is more data. This one is from Japan, from a colleague of mine. Mikiaki Uno is a leader in Japan. And they have looked at a randomized phase 2, phase 3 trial of neoadjuvant chemo with gemcitabine and S1 versus upfront surgery. 182 patients neoadjuvant, 180 patients adjuvant. Both arms got S1 as adjuvant for 6 months, and 2 cycles, 14 days gemcitabine plus S1 was a specific arm. And you can see what happens here. Neoadjuvant chemo and gemcitabine, you can see what's the survival. You get 36.7 months for neoadjuvant versus 26.6 months for those who underwent upfront surgery. No difference in resection rates, R0 rates, and morbidity. But again, more data coming in favor of neoadjuvant for borderline resectable disease. Then we have the JASPAC trial, just out in 2020 in Annals of Surgery. Neoadjuvant S1 with concurrent radiotherapy followed by surgery for BRPC. It's a phase 2 study. S1 and radiotherapy, full dose, 52 patients, 41 of them with confirmed BRPC, 63% R0 rate, a median survival, which is very encouraging, as you can see, of 30.8 months in this study from Japan. More recently, we've got the trial from MD Anderson led by my colleague Matt Katz. And here you see preoperative modified FOLFIRINOX with or without radiotherapy for BRPC. Big difference of 68 to 47% between FOLFIRINOX versus the radiotherapy arm. We do not as yet know the exact details as to why this has happened. This was presented at ASCO GI, but you can see that there are challenges when it comes to adding radiotherapy, and we still need to understand this trial more than what we are able to see. But there is an 18-month survival difference of 68 to 47%. This is the first randomized trial. There are challenges of this trial, and I won't go into the details in terms of heterogeneity and small group of patients, but this came from Korea. Jin Young Jang is a leader again from Seoul, and they looked at oncologic benefits of neoadjuvant chemorad with gemcitabine versus upfront surgery in this multi-center phase 2 and 3 trial. 27 patients neoadjuvant, 23 patients adjuvant, upfront surgery, and you see the difference in the Kaplan-Meier's. Primary endpoint was 2-year survival, and there was a difference again between the 2-year survival, 40% to 26%. This is not randomized, but good trial from a unit which does aggressive work for pancreatic cancer surgery, and that's from the former Johns Hopkins group. Chris Wolfgang has moved on now, but Jin He is another leader. And they looked at complete path response following neoadjuvant chemoradiation. Chemoradiation is still being actively looked more in America than in Europe, but they looked at it and they have got some good results. They show a median survival overall. Again, see the gap between the PAT-CR versus the non-PAT-CR. Median overall survival, 27 months. In PAT-CR group, median overall survival was not yet met at 60 months. So you can see that there is benefit. In 44% of the PAT-CR patients, no death or recurrence. And PAT-CR, negative lymph nodes, and neoadjuvant FOLFIRINOX were 3 independent predictors of overall survival in this retrospective group that they studied. So what's the level of evidence do we really have when we speak of neoadjuvant so much? The fact is we still need higher levels of evidence, but neoadjuvant therapy results in downstaging and resectability anywhere between 30 to 60% in borderline resectable or locally advanced unresectable tumors. and it does not influence surgical morbidity or mortality. So that's the good part for surgeons, that if there is neoadjuvant indicated, go ahead with it, and we can still do good surgery. And this has been our experience in Tata as well. So this is what we have published some time back. This series has increased and we will update it in a couple of years from now. But this was 63 resections, which were vascular, multivisceral resections, as in this picture. We have divided the splenic artery and swung it and replaced the hepatic artery, which was involved by the tumor. But there was no vein involvement. It was localized artery involvement, and we could do a Whipple resection in such a patient. Moving on, you have tumors like these, which are clearly unresectable pancreatic body tumors. In this case, celiac and proximal hepatic and splenic artery encased. We have given neoadjuvant treatment. We have safeguarded the gastroduodenal artery. We have divided the common hepatic artery. We have resected the celiac axis, done subtotal pancreatectomy like an Appleby procedure with radical surgical clearance. Patient has done well for more than 2 years since such surgery has been done. So this disease is very old and nothing about it has really changed. It is we who change in this era of neoadjuvant and modern day multi-agent chemo, and we learn what's possible with better surgery, what was formerly a little over a decade ago imperceptible. This is our data in our team at the Tata Memorial. You can see that we have increased our complexity, range, and volume of surgery. Even in COVID year of 2020, we managed to do 190 pancreatic resections. Thanks to the segregation policy that we adopted in Tata, we never stopped our cancer services throughout this year at the Tata Memorial. So we do have an experience of over 1,700 resections. Our mortality has crept up slightly for the kind of variety of work that we do. And we had some challenges last year itself, but still it's a very acceptable 3.5. But I'll show you some more data that in the last few hundred resections, our mortality is much lesser than that also. We've published this work of 1,200 Whipple resections, which is considered to be a landmark, especially for the low and middle income countries, as has been suggested by Martin Smith, who's the immediate past president of the IHPBA. What about our own data? We are working on this manuscript, which would be submitted anytime in the next 48 hours. 201 cases of resectable, borderline resectable pancreas cancer. And you can see that we do some cases which are upfront. Overall, 135 explorations. A lot of them have had neoadjuvant and explorations, and we have resected 103 of these. The R1 rate is 35, while the R0 is 62%. But I want you to also understand that despite neoadjuvant, there would be problems of progression of disease, quality of life, refusing surgery, etc. And this group is also a group which needs more attention so that we can improve the outcomes of what is obviously a difficult situation. We have seen that there is some improvement when it comes to offering them surgery if they take neoadjuvant. But of course, this is not a randomized trial. This is just a prospective study. And you can see that if you do an upfront resection, the survival is about 19 months, but it's about 22 months if we do post-neoadjuvant. And we see this kind of data coming up, but we still don't know. We will be interpreting this more carefully. There is some difference again in median disease-free survival, upfront resection versus post-neoadjuvant, though nothing is looking significantly different as of now. I also want to add beyond anatomy, biochemistry, and patient's condition, as I come towards the end of this talk now, is the role of precision oncology in surgery. This is something which is going to be the fourth arm. And just to briefly tell you, you can look at some of these biomarkers, and they are showing you, just concentrate here. If you have these two negative, you have the best survival. If you have both of them positive, you have the worst survival. So I think we will be able to select out patients and organize them and direct them to appropriate treatment arms, which would improve outcomes. This is towards the end now. So what would I do for pancreatic ductal cancer in 2021? For resectable disease, surgical resection, 6 months of post-op chemo or pre-op chemo with or without chemo-rad, followed by surgical resection and post-operative chemo. I think we would do the second part in cases where the ABC is bothering us. Otherwise, vast majority of upfront resectable would be resected first. In borderline resectable, we would be inclined more towards neoadjuvant and then reassess, despite the fact that the PREOPANC study showed only a subgroup analysis with improved survival, but otherwise there has been no clarity as far as level 1 evidence is concerned for borderline resectable disease. Some question? Somebody has made a comment, but I'll follow it afterwards. For locally advanced disease, it's obviously systemic chemotherapy, and in a percentage of patients, we would be able to offer surgery. Otherwise, they would continue for chemo and chemoradiotherapy. Metastatic disease is beyond the purview of this lecture. Last but not the least, what I presented is not my work. It is the work of our team at Tata Hospital. You see this team of GI surgeons, which I lead, and this is the colorectal group, the hepatobiliary group, as well as surgeons who work in my team for. You also see a large disease management group comprising of surgeons, radiation oncologists, medical oncologists, GI and HPB pathologists, radiologists, interventional radiologists, clinical trial coordinators, nutrition specialists. All of us work together at the Tata Hospital. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Srikhande. Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive presentation. So generally we take questions at the last, but
Sure.
We'll take the questions for you now itself, and rest of the questions we can take in the panel discussion. So there are a couple of questions here. One of the participants, Abbas, has asked that which artery you prefer to use in cases of portal vein resection. So obviously, you answered the question. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so we don't use an artery for a portal vein resection. We would always do a primary end-to-end in the vast majority of cases. If there is a defect of 3 to 3.5 centimeters for a portal vein resection anastomosis, a generous cattle brush maneuver will ensure that we cover the gap. We don't want any corkscrewing, or we don't want any laxity to the portal vein. It has to be straight. It's a high pressure system. They don't require any low molecular weight heparin, etc. Anything special, no anticoagulation except routine low molecular weight heparin. Now, in case the gap is such that we need to have a graft in between, we have placed PTFE grafts, but they have a tendency to get blocked, sometimes even more earlier than what we would like them to have. So that's not the best choice. The easiest choice now is taking the peritoneum. You can harvest the left renal vein and use it, which is just lying behind after a Cocker maneuver. But the easiest thing is to use the peritoneum. The French, my friend Safi Dokmak published this some time back, that you can use the peritoneum and then you can prepare as many grafts as you want and just put it for a portal vein. And you can prepare it over a 24 size Portex tube, suture it with 5-O-proline, and in no time you will have a segment of a new vein created, which can be put in as a graft between the SMV and the portal vein or whatever it may be. So this would be my answer.
What is your experience with this peritoneal portal?
Works very well. You can use it as a patch, and you can use it as we have a couple of patients who are actually recovering and doing very well without any challenges at all. It works as well as a regular vein. So for a vein anastomosis, I think the opportunities are immense without having to harvest any vein from the saphenous and the jugular. In Tata, we have easy access to harvesting the jugular vein if you want, but we've never felt the need to do that because majority of them are type 3. So you can do a primary anastomosis and cover a gap of anywhere between 1 to 3.5 centimeters. The problem comes when it is more than 3.5, and then we would look at a peritoneal patch first as an option.
Yeah. So there's another question which is in the context of the data which you showed about survival, and the question is negative lymph nodes. Is it before NACT or after NACT?
After NACT. For the neoadjuvant group that I presented, it's after NACT, because as you know, for upfront surgery for pancreatic cancer, even in resectable disease, a large number of patients would harbor node positivity, and only a minority of patients of pancreatic head or uncinate process cancer would have node negative. Of course, John Cameron, way back in 2006, when he published his series of 1,000 Whipple resections, in that 1,000 Whipple resections, he presented 64 patients who were node negative, and they lived long for sure. But it clearly means that you have less number of node negative patients. So in borderline resectable disease, vast majority of them would be node positive prior to chemo. But if they get neoadjuvant chemo, the good responders are obviously the ones who are getting a better resection and a better long-term survival outcome.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Sandeep, you wanted to add a comment or?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Nikhil. Dr. Shailesh, I have one query actually. As you said that for borderline resectable, if ABC is not a problem, you would go for a upfront surgery. So what all anatomical factors do you think would be there for you to consider neoadjuvant first?
So I think, as I showed you in those three figures, that technically you can do a lot, but we would get 57% patients positive for R1 resection on final pathology for upfront resections also. So anything where the disease involvement of the vein is tending towards more than 180 degrees, I would give neoadjuvant. We have enough, not highest level of data, but we have enough data, especially knowing that 80% of these patients are going to get a resection ultimately. You might lose out and there might be a dropout of 20% patients who are borderline resectable at presentation, but would have disease progression and would become locally advanced and unresectable after neoadjuvant. So for these 80% patients, there is a clear benefit for a systemic disease. So anatomically, anywhere where the vein involvement is not just to the right, but going behind the vein, or anywhere it's closing up to more than 180 degrees, I would give neoadjuvant. Now, a small tumor abutment, a 70-degree involvement of the vein, you having to do a type 2 or a straightforward type 3 resection to avoid wasting or narrowing of the vein. Those are the ones where we would do upfront resection as well. And we know that that is still justified. Many of the Americans would disagree with me, but unless and until we produce much better, higher quality data, we can't say that neoadjuvant treatment is the gospel truth. We clearly are in a process of developing more data and gaining more experience. So I would say both types of patients are very much there, but for vein involvement, we are going more and more towards neoadjuvant. That's obvious.
Thank you.
Sir, I have also a question. So, what is your opinion regarding the patients whom we start with the neoadjuvant chemotherapy and they tend to have a stable disease rather than a good response? So, would you like to go for a chemo radiation or a radiation after chemotherapy before surgery, or you would? How do you approach these patients?
Yeah, so there are two types of borderline resectables which are not as yet defined. You have a straightforward borderline resectable, and you have the extreme end of borderline resectable, which is close to locally advanced. So the extreme end of borderline resectable, which is close to locally advanced, we are individualizing patients who have initially received 4 cycles of chemotherapy and they have stable disease. And we would still be concerned about the R status, plus the fact that we are going to be working more closer to the arteries than the veins. The veins are less of a worry for us. In such patients, we would give radiotherapy. We are currently evaluating a NEVUS trial as well, evaluating short course radiotherapy, SBRT, but we still don't know. So in an individual patient, in some cases of extreme BRPC, we would give chemo and then radio and then resect. But if they are not extreme BRPC, then we would give 4 cycles of FOLFIRINOX, evaluate the patient ABC, And then we might add a couple of operate, or we might directly operate after 4. And there would be cases where we would also be aware that there is an emerging concept of total neoadjuvant therapy. So you might even give up to 8 and then operate. But this is something which is in evolution. I don't have hardcore data for 4 versus 6 versus 8 versus 4 followed by chemo rad versus chemo. That I still don't know.
And is there
So,
any
Dr.
certain subset where you choose radiation over chemo? Is there
No.
any certain subset of
To be
patients?
very
Okay.
honest, no. To be very honest, no, as of now, simply because we acknowledge that this is a systemic disease, and we acknowledge that surgery still plays a dominant role if the disease is localized and we can take it out well. So we would clearly depend more on surgery and chemo. In those areas where I'm going to be working on arteries, or that's going to make a difference, after after chemo, I think radio is coming in. But purely radio ahead of chemo, I would not find the role. Now, I also have sometimes an ongoing healthy argument with my radiation oncologist that sometimes we would have a case where there is good response to chemo. We would do a resection, patient has done well, but yet you might have an R margin positive, R1, not R2. I think these patients have responded well to chemo and it still remains a systemic disease. But if you can bring in chemo in the adjuvant setting, in some of these cases, it might work locally. So I would still believe that the final jury is yet out as far as the precise defined role of radiotherapy is concerned. I'm not buying the outcomes of the Alliance trial in toto, though they were negative for radiotherapy.
And Dr. Shikhande, what proportion of your patients will get FOLFIRINOX and what proportion will get GEM nab-paclitaxel?
I don't have hardcore data, but to be very honest, a good proportion, especially those who are likely to be fit for surgery at presentation, they are likely to be fit for modified FOLFIRINOX also. So I need to, I can communicate to you afterwards, maybe by speaking to my medical oncologist, because they have a good database to be able to exactly tell what proportion get M-FOLFIRINOX versus GEM nab-paclitaxel. But a large number of them are getting FOLFIRINOX. And now this number is clearly more than what it was 2-3 years ago. So I think it's also the confidence of the treating oncologist and the experience of the team to be able to handle something like FOLFIRINOX. Because for surgery, I'm very clear that it's not just the gemcitabine, it is the FOLFIRINOX which is making surgery worthwhile. So if my medical oncologist is uncomfortable about FOLFIRINOX for a BRPC, I would rethink whether I need to do upfront surgery, because BRPC is still resectable for me. But if they say patient is not fit for FOLFIRINOX, I would be worried. So as far as possible, we would encourage them for FOLFIRINOX. But I don't have the exact figure. The number is increasing. We are coming out with some publication, but I don't have the figure offhand.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. So with this, I think I would request Asit to start the panel discussion
Sure.
and take it forward.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll continue with the same discussion that we are carrying on. I'll just share my screen to have a few more questions that I intended to ask
Great.
Dr. Shikhande. And okay, is my screen visible?
It says
Not yet.
screen sharing. Yeah,
Yes,
we can
yes.
see it now. Yeah.
Okay, so right, so I mean, most of our audiences are residents. Okay,
Great.
I mean, your presentation was very lucid. It was very clear. But for the interest of residents, if we have to simply put it, resectable means no vein, no artery. Borderline resectable means venous involvement, no artery involvement, and locally advanced means either unreconstructible veins or arterial involvement, right? If we put it very simply for the understanding of our residents.
Yes. If I may add, I
Yeah.
may make the BRPC a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
That only the common hepatic artery, if 2 centimeters or less is involved,
Yes.
it is still classified as BRPC in addition to the vein.
Agreed. So now we have different definitions coming up. We have initial by Katz and Vradachari, and then we got a Mayo definition, and then NCCN. Then we have an IAP, and we also have an international study group of pancreatic surgery, which you are a part of as well. So which definition would you think is the most comprehensive one? Because there are subtle differences, mostly regarding the involvement of vein. Most of them would say that less than 180-degree vein involvement would be a resectable pancreas. NCCN at one point had the position that any venous involvement is a borderline resectable. So which definition would you think is the most relevant and most comprehensive, and which is most practical to be used?
So to me, the practicality comes in actually one of the slides that I put up in this talk, and I'm happy to share it with the residents. The practicality is that the vein, I don't mind whether it's less than 180 or more than 180. As long as you have two ends of the vein available for reconstruction, this is borderline resectable. So
Right.
you can have less than 180, more than 180. That will differentiate how you give or not give neoadjuvant treatment. But for pure surgical purposes, vein 180 less or more is still vein resection, borderline resectable. Vein not available for reconstruction is locally advanced, unresectable. And when it comes to arteries, if arteries are more than 180, then it is unresectable. So even arteries less than 180 is abutment, and you will be able to take them out in a number of cases. So the slide which I had shown was actually the easiest one, where you concentrate around the portal vein, superior mesenteric vein, celiac axis, and SMA. And then you define no contact is resectable, and less than 180 contact with artery, and even more than 180 contact with vein is borderline resectable, and more than 180-degree contact with arteries is making it locally advanced. So I would not say that we should stick to AHPBA, Mark Callery and Katz, or NCCN, or ISGPS, or IAP. But IAP is perhaps the better one because it is talking about the patient as a whole beyond just the anatomical features that we are discussing as surgeons.
Perfect, sir. So we have touched upon this point in a previous discussion as well. So if you have to do a minor venous reconstruction, a patient like this, you have a very borderline involvement, not even borderline, a small involvement, which will require either a type 1 or a type 2 reconstruction of the vein. So in present scenario, in today's era, would you be inclined on giving neoadjuvant to this particular patient if he or she is?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Asit. Your slides are not moving. Your slides are not moving.
It's not moving. I mean, which slide are you seeing right now?
Only the first one, the panel.
Just the intro slide.
I think you need to put it on a slide view and then start pressing page down.
No, it is moving here. So let me do it again, please. Sorry for the. So yeah. So if I'm trying to figure it out, what's wrong? Okay.
You have shared the slide and presentation. These are different screens.
Yeah, I'll share it again. I think I'll share it again. So what I'll do is
you concentrate on putting up the PowerPoint slide. I will give the answer to the question that you asked to save time.
Yeah. So if there is a very borderline involvement, a very small involvement. So in today's era, are you inclined on offering this patient upfront surgery or giving a neoadjuvant chemo?
As I said, the answer is again going to lie in the ABC classification. So you have the anatomy, which is clearly ready for upfront surgery. That's obvious. As I told Sandeep also, less than 180-degree involvement. If all the other features, for example, CA19-9 is not high, patient's performance status is excellent. You don't see a cluster of lymph nodes all around. Everything is looking like a clean, the way a periampullary tumor would look. And on a CT scan, you are just seeing one or two cuts which show that there is a degree of abutment and contact with the vein, and patient is completely fine. I think we would upfront resect. But same patient with a CA19-9 of 450, a patient who is having some performance status challenges, a lot of weight loss, etc., would should make you think that this disease is more likely to be a systemic problem rather than that 1 centimeter contact which would require a type 1 or a sleeve resection or a type 2 resection. So I think factor in ABC. That's why I feel that the ABC classification is a better classification for practical purposes, published in Pancreatology in 2018.
Okay, I think there is some challenge with my system here. I'm somehow not able to
But
share.
if you're on Zoom, you should be able to share. You have your presentation. You switch
Just
on
mail me.
all your presentations and you go to share screen.
No, it's there, but somehow it's just
Asit, just
probably
mail me your presentation. I'll present.
Yeah. In
okay.
the meantime, Dr. Asit, you can carry on with the questions. I think
Yeah.
the concept is very much understandable by this.
So,
everyone.
there are a couple of questions. I'll take.
Can I have a small
Yeah.
understanding from the surgeon?
Yes, sir. Please.
I mean, if there is a venous infiltration, not abutment, if there is a venous infiltration, even if it less than 180, but that means the disease is already inside the SMV, and that means there will be micrometastasis. So will that patient, irrespective of the contact point, would be a resectable case or an unresectable case?
So Dipanjan, what I would say is that whether the vein is in contact or infiltrated or abutted, that would not make me say that there would be micro tumor emboli, because to me, pancreas cancer is systemic and metastatic at presentation as a concept. It takes 10 years for a metastatic disease to develop. So actually we need better biomarkers and research, as you know very well. Disease is not happening in 2 months. So that's one part where I would slightly disagree with you. But to answer your question more technically, it's very difficult even on the best of CT scans to know the difference between infiltration and abutment. So all cases are looked upon as infiltration, but you may have finally about 50% cases where the vein is actually not infiltrated. That's the favorable thing on one hand. The other thing is the vein involvement is often considered by many psychologically as an advanced disease, but actually the anatomical location is in one of the most complicated areas of the body, with the hepatobiliary pancreatic system all coming together along with the digestive system in a small area. So many people still are of the opinion, and they are not wrong, that vein involvement is just a problem of where the tumor was located. There is nothing more aggressive about it. It is as good as a patient without a vein involvement. And again, we don't have a clear answer for this.
Thank you, Dr. Shikhande, as usual.
Yeah, so
Great answer.
is the slide share visible now?
Yes, you are visible. You are looking more comfortable. Your slides are there. Go on.
Yeah. So Nikhil, can you just go to the next slide, please? I think you are sharing it, right? Yeah. Next. Go to next. Yeah. So we have discussed all this. Next, please. Yeah. So yeah. Now, obviously, the discussion, the main part of discussion now, once we have gone through the basics of is whether to go for an upfront surgery or a neoadjuvant therapy. So next slide. So if you look at the, there is no doubt regarding a patient like this. You know, when Dr. Shikhande told about his case, this patient had massive venous involvement and abutment to SMA, which was close to about 180 degrees. This patient received FOLFIRINOX, and the next image that you see here on the right, in which this patient had an amazing response. I mean, this tumor shrunk to almost 50%. So these are the patients who will have a wonderful response to FOLFIRINOX. And when you see these kind of responses, you are motivated to give neoadjuvant to many of these patients. Next slide. Next slide, Nikhil. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. But if you look at the intention to treat analysis for most of these the series of neoadjuvant treatments, what we get to know is it actually the patient selection? Are we just selecting out the good biology disease rather than anything else? Is it there will be a dropout of patients, significant number? Is it just the part that we are selecting out good patients? That is why we are getting good response to our neoadjuvant therapy patients. Dr. Shikhande, I would like to have your views on this. If you look at the overall resectability rates in all of these neoadjuvant patients, resectability rates goes down, but R0 resection goes up. Is it just the factor that we are selecting out good risk patients and offering them surgeries rather than operating to everyone? Is it not the reason?
No, I think it's partly the answer. The reason is exactly what I discussed in the course of my talk, where we addressed all these concerns. A large number of patients would get systemic therapy earlier than later for a systemic disease. We do select out responders, but I would like to say that not necessarily it's always tumor downsizing. Even if you get stable disease without a change in size, the chemotherapy for the first time, as compared to the long-standing gemcitabine, is working in pancreas cancer than before. We obviously still are far away from the magic bullet, but we are much better than what we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So when you have better chemotherapy, which is working, even if there is no downsizing, you still have disease which is kept in control. And if you have got good quality surgery, it's only going to add beneficial effects to the patient. The R0 rates show that chemo is working and that quality of surgery is improving. That's one. Now, if we are selecting out responders, all studies have shown overall that about 17 to 20% patients will not get surgery. So that means 1 in 5. But the other 4 are the ones whom we are selecting out. But perhaps then we are offering surgery to those who truly deserve it, rather than offering surgery to all for something like BRPC.
Yeah, so I mean, if we go by that analogy, so should we be shifting more towards offering a neoadjuvant chemotherapy to all of these patients, rather than saying that, okay, surgery is still a better option in those whom I can resect? So borderline resectable, like you said in the beginning of your talk, what is borderline resectable for you may be an unresectable disease for me, right? You have treaded a path for far longer and your skill sets are at much higher level than for someone like me who has, the aptitude of resecting veins and arteries is much lesser. So in that scenario, should we not just try and select out biology for most of these patients, or rather all of these patients, rather than embarking on early surgery?
So they have tried to look at that in America, where they are trying to look at I think your question is focused on resectable pancreatic cancer. That if it's working to some extent on locally advanced, and if it is working in something like borderline resectable, why also not attempt it for resectable disease without any vascular involvement? We still know in oncology as a basic principle that all localized solid tumors are best treated if they can come out. And the bigger challenge in pancreatic cancer has been the R1 resections. Having said that, even resectable disease without vein involvement, you can get about 60% of them positive. And this has prompted people to look at neoadjuvant approaches even in resectable pancreatic cancer. But we are far away from getting any conclusive good level evidence to justify superiority of neoadjuvant treatment over upfront surgery for resectable disease. We have not even got superiority of neoadjuvant treatment in borderline resectable disease. So in borderline resectable, we are selecting out responders. In resectable disease, we are still not there, but it will come in for resectable disease also the day we have chemotherapy, which is going to produce results which are even better than FOLFIRINOX. That's what's going to drive the next round of clinical trials evaluating resectable pancreatic cancer and treating it as a systemic disease to begin with. Just now, we still look at surgery because it is still got very poor quality chemotherapy. It's better than before, but we are still a long way off. I don't think it can displace surgery as yet.
Right. Nikhil, can you go to next slide, please? I think, sir, we are already beyond 8. So in case it's like pressing you for the time. So
I'll listen to you. You don't have to be pressurized. I will enjoy the discussion. I'll sit for another 5 minutes and go. You carry on. If I have to butt
Right.
in, I will butt in with your permission.
Yeah, sure, definitely, sir. And now we would like to have inputs from our medical oncology colleagues as well. So Dipanjan, we know by the data that if you give FOLFIRINOX, only 40% of them would respond, and so is with the case with gemcitabine-based chemotherapies. Most of the studies have shown that FOLFIRINOX respond better. Patient receiving FOLFIRINOX respond better. In our personal experience, in our center, our medical oncologists, when they see a patient with a little bit of, they get little tipsy and tossy if they have to start FOLFIRINOX. So more often than not, our patients are getting gemcitabine-based chemotherapy. Now, how do you choose your patient? Like in case of Dr. Srikhande, he said he would insist that his medical oncologist give FOLFIRINOX to his patients. What is your practice, your personal experience, and how comfortable are you offering FOLFIRINOX to your patients?
Thanks, Ashit. So if you remember about 10 years back, when at ILBS I started FOLFIRINOX, we were very, very apprehensive. In fact, I spoke to Dr. Milind Javle on an international call, almost 15-20 minutes. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. And then that was the beginning. And then he suggested that at that time, that NEGM paper from the Prodigy group just came. He suggested that we remove the bolus 5-FU, and we did that. And since then, I'm using modified FOLFIRINOX without much complication. In fact, to be honest, it is not 40%. If you look at the retrospective study from Heidelberg group, it is almost 61% resection rate, and so is the Karolinska group. Whereas the gem-nab-paclitaxel, although retrospective study, has shown in one study, if I remember, around 15 to 20% resection rate. So as far as resection rate is concerned, because I think you are asking for a neoadjuvant, I think modified FOLFIRINOX is definitely a better option. As far as
Dipanjan,
yeah.
I completely agree with what you said. Just for the sake of the younger residents, I wanted to add only one more thing. The Heidelberg group, which spoke about 60% response rates, though I have a soft corner for Heidelberg and I have friends there, but their paper actually I partly criticized because they have put borderline resectable and locally advanced all in one basket. So, but actually the figures are even better for only borderline resectable. For only borderline resectable, you will have about 80% with resections. For locally advanced, they have also improved because they are a high volume and focused on pancreatic surgery. Just an addition to what you are talking, which I agree with you. Thank you.
And secondly, I think this year, the NCTN group has come with their 18 months of survival data with modified FOLFIRINOX, and it has shown almost, I think, like if I remember, 66% or so at 18 months, which is sort of not hard before. I mean, so so coming to the question, so in most of the cases, if the patient has PS0 and PS1, definitely it is modified FOLFIRINOX. Even for PS2, if the patient is relatively young and doesn't have any other comorbidities, and his low performance status is basically disease related, I would still take a chance. The only advantage gem-nab-paclitaxel offer me, that's in weekly chemotherapy, and I can modify the dose much in a malleable way. I mean, I can do a day 1, day 8 instead of day 1, day 8, day 15. I can, instead of 125 milligram per meter square NAB packages, and give you 100 milligram per meter square. The gemcitabine I can use from 1000 milligram per meter square, or 850 milligram meter square, even up to 600 milligram per meter square. But for a young patient who I'm looking, or my surgeon is looking at me to get resection done, I think I trust on modified FOLFIRINOX, and it is not actually as toxic. And if you look at the original PRODIGE data, although there were a lot of grade 3 reaction, but there was no death due to chemotherapy as such. So I think FOLFIRINOX is fine, unless patient has some cardiac issue, angina, or develop some reaction with this. Otherwise, I'm fine with modified FOLFIRINOX any day.
So is it safe for you to say that FOLFIRINOX regimen is the regimen of choice, and this should be preferred for all the cases of neoadjuvant chemotherapy in CA pancreas? Can you put this forward to all the residents so that it's clear to them?
So I would put it in this way: unless otherwise contraindicated, the modified FOLFIRINOX as a neoadjuvant chemotherapy has a better it is a better choice as far as resection rate and progression-free survival, and most probably, although I don't think there is a randomized control trial between GemNab versus modified FOLFIRINOX.
Oh, there is. I'll share you.
The swab
That was a very, I know about that, Asit, but that was a very small getting a conclusion. The big data will be coming, I think, somewhere in 2021.
Yeah, so the interim analysis is starting to come. You have the alliance.
Yes, don't.
So, yeah, next slide. Nikhil, can you put on the next slide, please? One second. Yeah. So I mean, okay. So
have data, but I am Knox, and but you know, your surgeon should be a part of the decision making. So that is something I've learned the hard way. If you can carry your surgeon with you, that builds a trust and friendship. And I mean, then he is. So you must convince your surgeon also that that's the best. And once you work together as a team, so you must choose your surgeon and vice versa, and then each other try to trust, and that's how the results improve. But in one year, I think it is modified FOLFIRINOX.
Right. So that is what I wanted to hear, that we will go extra mile to give modified FOLFIRINOX to our patients if possible, right?
Yes.
Okay. So do you have any experience, and are you aware of any data of use of biologicals or immunotherapy? So I've heard some wonderful response. We have had one patient, which Nikhil was discussing with me the other day, that he was PD-L1 inhibitor, and then he got Pembro, and that he had an amazing response to this, and his tumor almost melted away. So is there?
So you must understand. I think the surgeon especially must understand how immunotherapy works. First of all, we do not know everything about immunotherapy. We are still like the blind person trying to figure out what is the figure of elephant. First of all, not every patient of immunotherapy get response. It is roughly about 20%. Secondly, maximum response with immunotherapy can be something like stable disease or partial response, so as a neoadjuvant. Thirdly, pancreatic cancer, unlike a cancer like melanoma, which has a lot of mutation, pancreatic cancer does not have too many mutations. So there are only a few patients we will have microsatellite instability or deficient MMR. They are supposed to get benefit from pembrolizumab, but you also must understand the data of pembrolizumab was initially with few patients. I mean, in that whole cohort, actual pancreatic cancer, I think less than 10. One of them did get PCR, of which FDA has approved, but I think we still have to go a long way. But there is one aspect of immunotherapy which I must tell you, that because of the memory T cell, immunotherapy, unlike any other therapy, can have a very long-lasting response because the immune cell remembers. It's like vaccine. So those 20% patients who responds, few of them can have really, really long-lasting response, even when you have stopped treatment. That is what we have never seen or unlikely to be seen with chemotherapy. But as a neoadjuvant treatment, I think immunotherapy is still not there. There are some, but nowadays we all are trying to get into next-gen sequencing of all the cancers, because if the patient has a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, it has been shown that olaparib maintenance can have some effect. And if the patient has, again, that MSI high or the BRCA mutation, then cisplatin can be a drug, or there is another mutation called PALB2. Then with gemcitabine and cisplatin can have an unusually better response, because cisplatin also breaks, the DNA strands. And in case of BRCA mutation is there, or a deficiency of MMR, then the cell cannot really repair that breakage, and the cell death gets exponentially increased. So I think it is really pertinent for us to understand that we must try to get good amount of tissue. So just US FNA is not sufficient for me. It has to be a US biopsy or a CT biopsy so that I can get the tissue to understand the disease better. But as of now, as a neoadjuvant treatment, I don't think neither biological nor immunotherapy is standard of care.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please, Nikhil. Yeah. So now the data of neoadjuvant CTRT. We have to have a discussion on radiation. So in our experience, I mean, unfortunately, whatever little experience we have of downgrading our preoperative patients, it is with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. We don't have any personal experience of having radiation, but as a surgeon, we do have apprehension of operating on an irradiated field. So let me ask my surgical colleagues here, Dr. Kishore, do you have any personal experience of operating on a neoadjuvant chemo-RT patients of pancreas? And if yes, was it any different from operating on a neoadjuvant chemotherapy alone patient?
Thanks, Dr. Asit, but no, just like you, I think I have not had any personal experience of operating on a radiated field for pancreatic cancer.
Okay, and Sandeep, do you have any experience of irradiating on a chemo-RT patient?
Yeah, we have actually 2 patients in our experience where neoadjuvant chemoradiation were given in some other hospital. One was in Delhi and another was in Ahmedabad. And we actually didn't have any problem which we could, figure out that it is because of the radiotherapy, preemptive radiotherapy. So it was something like a borderline resectable type of thing with lots of adhesions, and you have to be careful for the kind of carefulness you have for the borderline resectable case, but nothing which could be for me to understand that it is because of the radiation per se.
Okay, I don't know if we have Dr.
Although just one more thing, although the texture of pancreas was hard, and I'm not sure whether radiotherapy had a role in that particular patient or not.
Okay,
can I just interject?
Yeah, Dr. Mitra, hi. So, so I think, is this fear unfound? I mean, we as a surgeon have a vast experience of operating. Have experience of operating in rectum. We have experience of operating in thorax for esophageal malignancies. But this is something, so I'll come to data later, whether it's actually the data supports the use of radiation at present or not. But do you think is this, and what is the experience in your center of giving neoadjuvant chemo-RT to borderline pancreatic resection? And what is your interaction with Dr. Shivendra about the difficulties that he has faced?
Yeah. Like, everybody everywhere, neoadjuvant chemoradiation has not yet been the standard of practice. In our hospital, yes, we have done a very few patients who have been operated post-radiation. And I haven't heard of anything negative, some leakage problem or any other, I have not heard. But of course, definitely very few patients. The patients we have given neoadjuvant radiation, they are the borderline resectable, post 3 cycles of chemotherapy or 4 cycles of chemotherapy, and they have become stable, they have been stable. So these are the patients whom we have given radiation therapy. Now, having said that, just because there are many students over here, I would like to clarify a few things, that why radiation is, why we are so scared of radiation, and also why is radiation being reconsidered these days. Now, radiation, initially, if you go to the history of pancreatic carcinoma being treated, radiation used to be a very important role in the treatment of pancreatic carcinoma because it had a local control. Although the overall survival, except 2 studies, was same as in chemotherapy. But this local control is required. If you see many studies where the morbidity has been, or deaths have been due to local morbidities, that means some obstruction or local lymph nodes coming up or biliary obstruction. Now, radiation, when we add, it has actually the local control has been very good, but the problem has become that the distant metastasis has increased. So why did it increase? That is because probably the dose we are giving is inadequate. That is inadequate local dose, probably because of the important organs nearby. And also that is a long duration of treatment, because it is a very long 5 weeks of chemotherapy, radiation therapy. So that probably gives a window for the distant metastasis to come up. So this we have nowadays the SBRT. So we have started doing SBRT, not in neoadjuvant actually, but most of these, they were borderline resectable. They have done well with chemotherapy. And these are the patients we have started giving SBRT. So now the question you were asking about the surgical implications. So with SBRT, if we do an SBRT, we expect that the surgical complications, if at all, would be less, because we are giving these radiation a high dose per fraction. So the acute effects would be less. Whatever effects if we have, they would be late effects. So radiation therapy, now we can give higher doses of radiation with more conformal and image-guided radiation therapy and SBRT together. So that gives us the benefits of the radiation therapy, that is the local control. We increase the local control and at the same time do not delay the chemotherapy, which is definitely required because we believe that pancreatic carcinoma is a systemic disease.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, till now, I don't think we have a very robust data to support the use of routine chemotherapy, routine radiation in neoadjuvant setting for borderline resectable pancreas. And I think most of us share that experience. I think in majority of our centers, I don't know about Tata, whether they are using it as a routine, but what I gather from Dr. Srikhande's talk was that even they are not using it as a routine there, nor are we using it at Max, and what I gather from your experience as well. So it's not a standard of care as if now for a neoadjuvant treatment. Now, if I have to...
The NCCN this year, the NCCN has included SBRT as an option.
Yeah, so I mean, the data that has come off late, I mean...
Yeah, data we don't have data, definitely.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have to add, and then it will be on case-to-case basis. Most of us, if you ask me as a surgeon, I would be more than happy to operate after a neoadjuvant chemotherapy, that too after a FOLFIRINOX, then if I have to operate for a chemo-RT patient. Now, in your experience, Dr. Kishore, I mean, there is a tendency of decreased leak rates after neoadjuvant treatment. It is mostly attributable to, they say if you give chemotherapy, there is higher fibrosis, and if you give radiation, there is probably higher fibrosis, which leads to decrease in leak rates after neoadjuvant treatment. So do you think this could be the reason, or it's the fact that we are operating on such locally advanced pancreatic cancer, which itself makes that pancreatic gland very hard and ducts are dilated? So, so what's your take on this, and what's your personal experience about complications after operating on neoadjuvant patients?
I think the literature also quotes this. I think most of the reviews and systematic reviews and meta-analysis, if you see, there is a tendency towards leak rates decreasing after neoadjuvant therapy. In fact, that is quoted as one of the advantage. But I really can't be sure if that is the only reason, or if it is because of, you know, fibrosis for other reasons. But whatever it is, I think the literature at least says that leak rates are lesser after neoadjuvant therapy, especially if radiotherapy is added. I think there's an element of fibrosis. But personally, I think the numbers are too small for me to actually put in my personal experience to say whether the leak rates are lesser vis-a-vis with and without neoadjuvant therapy. I think if you're in a high volume center, or if you're an experienced pancreatic surgeon, I think this is probably not a significant factor, but it is quoted often as one of the factors.
Right. So, Dr. Sandeep, if I may ask you, what is your personal experience on operating on the neoadjuvant treated patients of borderline resectable pancreatic cancer? Have you seen that there is any increase in the rate of complications? Have pancreatic fistulas increased, or it has rather decreased, as what literature suggests?
See, again, my experience of operating patients after neoadjuvant is not such a big experience that I can, you know, deduce something on these things. But this much I can tell, that we haven't encountered anything significantly more often in these patients than in a normal patient. And one thing I would like to add, that probably in most of the papers which I have read in a comparative arm, where they have compared the post-operative complication rates in a group where they have given neoadjuvant versus standard Whipple's group. I think in the standard group, they have included Whipple's done for periampullary cancers as well, like ampullary, duodenal, and bile ducts. And by its nature, the pancreatic cancer, pancreatic head cancer, has significantly less leak rates. So maybe, I mean, it's a speculation. What did you ask? The another thing you have asked, I think.
No, I mean, that was the main issue,
Okay.
whether the leak rates and other complications are reduced after neoadjuvant therapy, or do they increase, or is it the function of the disease per se, or is it the function of the neoadjuvant therapy? So it's just a matter of, I think, speculation that we can say.
Definitely, it has not increased in my experience, but the experience is not that much that I can deduce that it has a positive effect.
Right. So, I mean, so we can at least deduce the fact that it does not make our surgery any difficult, and complication rates does not increase after neoadjuvant therapy of borderline resectable pancreatic cancers.
Correct.
Right. Next slide, please. Right. Now we come to the technical consideration of it. Dr. Sandeep, if we have to contemplate a vascular resection, a portal venous resection, I think artery first approach is something which has been discussed a lot. And in his talk, Dr. Srikhande, described it quite eloquently. So there are so many approaches of this artery first technique. So how, in your practice, how do you choose which approach to take, and do you find one better over the other?
See, when it became in vogue, the artery first approach, we had attempted few Whipples by this approach in any standard patient, I mean resectable patient, just to make ourselves well versed with the technique. But in my limited experience in all the borderline resectable patients in which we had to do venous resections, we had done it by a normal approach without going for an artery first approach. Maybe the reason is that in most of our patients, in fact, in all of our patients, there was no ambiguity in terms of arterial involvement or its relation to the extent of 180 or whatever degrees. It is purely a venous involvement case. And in a very few patients where we had to resort to arterial resection and reconstructions also, most of them were the common hepatic artery involvement, where we had to do a resection and reconstruction, as was defined by Dr. Chalet as another angle definition, addition to the definition of borderline resectable. So it was not related to SMA in any way. So we could do all these cases by a standard approach.
Right, but the one of the proposed advantage of using an artery first is that once you have disconnected the uncinate and the pancreatic uncinate process from the artery, your clamp time for portal vein reduces, and you can get away with less ischemia on the liver. So do you think that matters, or if you go by the standard approach or the standard technique, it doesn't make that much of a difference in your practice?
Actually, in my opinion, whether you go for a artery first approach or a normal approach, the clamp time doesn't make any difference, because ultimately the point where you apply clamp is only when your uncinate process is separate from the vessels, whether you are doing it artery first or without that. We apply clamps only once everything is in your hand and is attached only to the vein. Rest everything is separate. You know what I mean? The whole of the specimen is only attached to the portal vein SMV complex, and rest everything is in your hand. Then only is the time to apply clamp. So it really does not matter whether you are doing a artery first or a standard way of resection.
Right. Dr. Kishore, what is your take on this? I mean, what's your experience on doing an artery first approach? And certainly in specific scenarios, like if you have an accessory right hepatic artery arising from an SMA, would you consider an artery first approach as a better preferred technique?
Yeah, I think I agree with whatever Dr. Sandeep said. I think, see, it's probably a little overrated, the artery first approach, because it's a sort of new thing and everybody is jumping on the bandwagon. I think the principles of vascular resection still remain the same, whatever approach you use. You have to obviously have inflow and outflow control. And when you're ready to resect the specimen, you should minimize the warm ischemia time to the liver as much as possible, even though there's an arterial inflow. So I think basically it's a combination of various techniques you use and you dissect from various directions. But having said that, artery first approach has some advantages, I think, especially if you're talking about a borderline resectable pancreatic cancer. Since there are registrars, what you should remember is one important point is, even after you give neoadjuvant therapy, your resectability is not assessed on a CT scan, because the CT scan will not downstage it like a conventional, say, tumor in some other area. So here, after you give neoadjuvant therapy and do a CT, the CT scan still might look the same. So you can't call the patient unresectable. You have to explore and decide on table whether the patient is resectable or not resectable. So in this instance, maybe if you do a posterior approach, so you can actually identify the origin of the SMA and trace it downwards towards the tumor. And then you can say, without doing too many irreversible steps like transecting the pancreas or dissecting too much, not transecting the jejunum. Some of the other approaches, the medial approaches actually entail division of the jejunum. Anterior approach entails division of the pancreas. So I think a posterior approach may be specifically useful if you've given both neoadjuvant therapy and you have a doubt about the borderline resectability, whether it's resectable or not. The same scenario where you mentioned, if it's a replaced right artery, again, a posterior approach may help, because if it's coming off the SMA, you can see and trace the artery and see if it is, separable from the tumor. Sometimes, if you've not carefully looked at the CT, the artery may actually be coursing through the tumor, or it may be coursing through the head of the pancreas, but away from the tumor. So you might have to do an arterial resection there sometimes. So I think in those instances, artery first approach, a posterior approach specifically may help. So these are my viewpoints.
Right. So the one of the special circumstances that you just mentioned is that you have a aberrant right hepatic artery or a replaced right hepatic artery, and it is coursing through the tumor. So by definition, this will be a borderline resectable. And if you detect it beforehand, it will be prudent that we pre-treat this patient with chemotherapy or chemoradiation, whichever you prefer. So in such a scenario, what is your approach? I mean, would you want to, would you like to sacrifice this artery? Would you want to reconstruct this artery? Or would there is another technique or another approach that has been suggested that you can, embolize this artery couple of weeks prior to a surgery so that there is enough collateralization. So what is your take on that?
I think it depends on what philosophy you adopt and how much you're comfortable doing.
Yeah, 2 लाख का क्या है? 2,10,000. मैंने हिसाब लगाया 50,000 का थोड़ा लग रहा है 2 लाख बाकी सब
I would request everyone to mute themselves, please, so that discussion can go on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, since it's a main right hepatic artery, I think if you if you've not looked at the CT scan properly, or if you detect it on table, I think there's no other option but to reconstruct it. I think the right hepatic artery has to be reconstructed. But if you detect it preoperatively, yes, embolization is a theoretical option. So I would personally, if you ask me, I would think of reconstructing the right hepatic artery.
Right. So if you have the techniques available, this should be a preferred approach. Right. Next slide, please.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Actually, this is the flaw in the definition of borderline resectable tumor. I mean, to me, at least, in my understanding, because the involvement of replaced right hepatic artery is actually the function of just the anatomical position of the artery. It is not the advanced nature of the disease per se, as is the any other borderline resectable. So probably the consideration of neoadjuvant in this setting, all these tumors where a replaced right hepatic artery arising from SMA should be considered as a resectable tumor rather than a borderline resectable.
Yeah, what you're saying is absolutely right, sir. But by definition, this comes under a borderline resectable.
Yeah, I mean,
but
that is what
borderline
that is the flaw.
resectable does not mean that you have to give them a neoadjuvant chemotherapy or chemoradiotherapy. You can still choose to go ahead and resect out these borderline resectable cases.
Because the thing is that in borderline resectable, the idea of giving neoadjuvant is to downsize the tumor so that you might be able to preserve the vessel. But in this particular scenario of borderline resectable, where the artery is going through the head of the pancreas, through the tumor, because of its anatomical position, the aim of preserving that vessel is never going to be achieved, even by neoadjuvant.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a valid point. So now let's come on to the resection of the portal vein. So when we say that portal vein is not reconstructible, what does it mean to you, and how an unconstructible portal vein is? Is it the location of the tumor which is important for you? So by CT definition, we know that if the tumor is going below the inferior margin of duodenum, and this is where it is involving the SMV, where it has bifurcated into the jejunal ileal branches, we know it is not reconstructible. What is the other unconstructible vein for you?
You are asking me?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay. So for me, the unreconstructible portal vein situation would be involvement of jejunal branches, where I would not like to, proceed if they are definitely, either preoperatively or on table. If we find that jejunal branches are involved, we don't proceed with that. Rest in every case, we could do a portal vein resection and reconstruction. And in fact, we in our experience, end-to-end anastomosis is possible to the extent of 4.5 centimeter of resection of portal vein SMV complex, where by extensive cattle brush maneuver, we could still do the end-to-end reconstruction.
Right. So in your experience, how often do you have to use a vein graft to, or any sort of graft, be an autologous or be a prosthetic graft, to bridge the gap?
We had a single situation where we had to use out of around, I think, 20 odd patients. In only one patient, we could not have a proper end-to-end anastomosis. And in that situation also, the distance was not big. It was just a 3 centimeter segment resection. But once we reconstructed it by end-to-end anastomosis, when we measured the pressure gradient across the anastomosis, we could found a big difference. So the anastomotic site was blocked because of the clot. So we revised it and used a PTFE graft, because we were not prepared for the autologous graft in that patient.
Okay. Dr. Kishore, do you have any experience of using the peritoneal patch that Dr. Shikhande was alluding to? I mean, have you any personal experience of using such technique? I mean, it's such a easily available material. You can strip the peritoneum out and do whatever you wish to. The way he was describing, you would never have to use any other graft ever if you can use that. So do you have any experience of?
No personal experience. We've just used end-to-end anastomosis. I think this was talked about a lot in the last IHPB also. I think this peritoneal grafts. But the thing is, see, we don't know what's the long-term patency. It has no intima. So, I mean, it's a good tube to bridge the gap. But having said that, most of these pancreatic cancers are advanced, and as such, their survival may not be very long, even with the best of treatment. So we don't really require very long-term patent grafts, I suppose. So no personal experience, but I think it's worth doing if you're caught in a fix and then you need an urgent thing. The other thing is there are these commercially available bovine pericardial patches, which are ready-made tube grafts, which also can be used in some times.
So if you have a longer length or a gap between the two ends of the vein, what are the various techniques that you can use to bridge that gap, to lessen that gap? So Dr. Kishore, if you can help us then, something like ligating the splenic vein or IMV, or there are another technical tips that you can share with us?
I think one was already mentioned, extended cattle brush maneuver may actually reduce the gap a little bit. And the other things are ligating some tributaries might give you some length. But at the end of the day, if you feel that it is going to be a tension in the anastomosis, it's better to put an interposition graft. I mean, you have to take the decision quickly, because this should be thought about and planned pre-op rather than having a situation intra-op. That's the important thing when you're planning a vascular resection. It should not be a surprise. So you have to plan out all the strategies pre-op. And then if you feel that it is going to be a problem bridging it, you should have already arranged for a graft which is there, or have a plan to bridge the graft. I think that's the message I would like to give to the registrars. It should be a planned resection, always vascular resection, so that it can be done in a comfortable, elegant way without a lot of hodgepodge on table.
Can I come in?
Yeah, sure, please, sir.
Actually, one thing regarding the apprehension related to splenic vein ligation, in most of our patients, actually the location of the segment which you are removing, whether it's below the splenic vein or opposite to the splenic vein, makes a lot of difference. And in case you are stuck in a situation where you need to sacrifice the junction of splenic vein portal vein, that this connection doesn't harm in any way in our experience. There have been 5 or 6 cases in which we had done that, and it can be done very easily without any post-operative negative consequences. One small thing regarding that peritoneal patch, we had one experience of trauma patient where IVC, suprahepatic IVC was damaged severely, and our CTVS surgeon helped us in that case, and he suggested, that was long back in 2006, he suggested and put that peritoneal patch, and that patient did very well after that. So I think peritoneal patch has some promise as per the experience of the CTVS surgeons, which are using it for quite some time.
Right, great. Next slide, please, Nikhil. Yeah, so for the completion's sake, I mean, choosing the patient for arterial resection. So a short segment hepatic artery involvement or a GDA involvement going up to the hepatic artery is considered as a borderline resectable. And the resection of that artery is definitely on resection and reconstruction. And so is any accessory right hepatic artery arising and coursing through the tumor. What about the resection of SMA or celiac axis? do you have any personal experience of that? And do you think there is any survival advantage to the patients who have involvement of SMA or celiac axis? I'll start with you, Dr. Jan, if you can throw some light on that.
No, actually, SMA involvement, we in our practice, we don't consider them for arterial resection for SMA and reconstruction. We just, don't go for surgery at all.
Okay, so they are straightforward unresectable patients if they are
For
to
us,
be.
yes, for us,
Yeah.
they are unresectable. Yeah.
Okay, and what about if there is an involvement of celiac axis, that would not be in the case of obviously the C-head pancreas, but in the body, your tail pancreas. So if that is giving you an R0 resection, would you be keen on offering surgery to these patients?
I had only one patient in which I did celiac axis resection for body tumor, and the post-operative outcome was not very good. The patient had metastasis within 3 or 4 months after surgery. So I am, not very keen on going for celiac axis resection for pancreatic cancers,
Right.
based on my limited experience.
Yeah, Dr. Kishore, what is your take on arterial resection? What is your position? Do you think if a patient who had a borderline resectable and he had responded well to chemotherapy, a good risk patient, would you be keen on offering a patient arterial resection if that is giving you an R0?
I think I largely agree with Dr. Sandeep. Since there are a lot of registrars here, the clear message should be that SMA resection is never done for a pancreatic head tumor. It is considered unresectable, even by all the criteria, and NCC and MD Anderson. All centers do not resect SMA. It's considered unresectable. That's clear. About the celiac axis, again, the difference between arterial and venous resections we should know. The reason is arteries have a lot of perineural plexuses around them. So any artery involvement is considered to be quite advanced and it's likely to have poor outcomes. So you should be very, very choosy in selecting a patient for an arterial resection. Coming to the specific question of celiac, personally, I've never had to do one. But I guess if I have to do it, will be in a very carefully selected group of patients with all the other things, good biology and who's likely to have a long survival. So in a very select group, yes, I would be tempted to do a celiac artery resection. But again, we should remember that, you should remember that sometimes if you take out the celiac, you don't have to actually reconstruct it. If the celiac is blocked with the tumor for some time, you would have already given neoadjuvant chemo or chemoradiation. So there will be a flow from the superior mesenteric artery through the GDA into the hepatic artery. So there will be some flow. So you may not actually have to reconstruct the celiac artery. So it may be like an Appleby procedure. So in those instances, I may selectively resect the celiac artery without having to reconstruct it. That is in a very select group of patients who are, low CA19-9, not much nodal disease, good response to chemotherapy, good performance status. In those particular, theoretically, I would think of resecting. I've never had to do one so far.
Okay, and what is your so basically, as per the literature, what you are trying to suggest is that there is no role of having an arterial resection that is an unresectable disease, and for theoretical discussion purposes, that should not be an indication for surgery, right?
Only for SMA.
For SMA.
Yeah, for SMA involvement. Yeah. And for a short segment hepatic artery involvement or a replaced right hepatic artery involvement, if that is amenable and giving us an R0 resection, that can be safely proceeded to, right? Yeah. So there is a question from the audience. What is the role of PET CT for the evolution, for the response assessment for after a neoadjuvant therapy? Or would you want an MRI in this setting to be? Do you find MRI as a better tool? Like you mentioned initially in one of the chats, that doing an CT scan may not give us a right amount of idea, because there will be a lot of edema and CT may not be able to differentiate between tumor versus the desmoplastic reaction. So would you prefer a PET CT over CT, or add an MRI to assess the response better? I'll start with you, Dr. Sandeep.
Yeah, I mean, see, as far as the response of treatment to the local region is concerned, PET CT to me is, the purpose is that, suppose one of my patients had a neoadjuvant therapy, and then I go for PET CT. The only objective for me in that to look is whether there is any development of metastasis in that patient. For the local resectability, either you do PET CT or a contrast enhanced normal CT scan, the picture will remain same. There won't be significant amount of change you would be noticing, suggesting you that there is an adequate response or not. In fact, that is why the indirect way of assessing the response is whether the size of the tumor from the pre-neoadjuvant scan is static or not. If it is static and it is not increased, that means you must go ahead for surgery and assess that on table.
Dr. Asit, can I just make a comment?
Yeah,
Hello?
please, Dr. Dipanjan, go on.
Yes, so unlike esophageal cancer, where there are data that PET scan can be a prognostic as well as predictive marker for treatment response. You have Municon 1 and Municon 2. In pancreatic cancer, there is no such data, and a good quality CT scan with pancreatic protocol is the best. In fact, the problem with PET CT, as Dr. Sandeep has pointed out, the CT component in most of the PET center is very bad, and the most of the person who is reporting are from nuclear medicine. With all due respect, the anatomical data from those PET CT is inadequate, and to get a data for local area anatomy, you actually have to do again a good quality contrast enhanced CT scan with a pancreatic protocol. So unless and until the only advantage of pancreatic PET CT can give is to show to a distal metastasis or not. Except that in pancreatic cancer, PET CT really doesn't have any role. The resident should understand that. Unlike colon cancer, where PET CT is required, sort of, or in lymphoma, in most of the hepatobiliary and GI malignancy, for local anatomy, PET CT is actually inferior because the PET machine, the CT, is an inferior quality CT.
In fact, Dr. Asit, if I can add to this, can I?
Yeah, sure, sir, please.
Okay. So in one of our patients where the patient received neoadjuvant CRT, when we had a repeat scan just before surgery, they were showing the same kind of tumor which was there pre-neoadjuvant. And we resected that tumor. It could be resected. And to our surprise, the tumor size is reduced to just less than 1 centimeter size. Though the radiological scans, both PET CT and the contrast enhanced CT with pancreatic protocol were showing the same kind of size radiologically.
Right, exactly. So that was the point. So CT is little inferior in detecting the response because it cannot differentiate between the tumor versus the fibrosis that has risen out of your neoadjuvant therapy. So in that case, is MRI a better modality? That is one. But yes, data has shown, there is good amount of data on that says that MDCT is still the modality of choice. And if you see most of these, the borderline resectable and advanced cancers, locally advanced cancers, this definition is actually based on CT scan imaging findings, not on MRI per se. So obviously, CT would be a go-to modality, and you can add MRI to have a better assessment of the fibrosis or the response assessment if you wish to. Right. So I think that brings to the conclusion of this session.
I mean, just for the completion's sake, I would request you to just mention about the methods of reconstruction for arterial resections. I mean, for the residents and, people are...
Right. So please, you can enlighten us on that.
I mean, the literature mentions 2-3, like for example, replaced right hepatic artery. The best modality in our experience was to reconstruct that by using the end of GDA.
Right.
So that is because they are very closely placed, and it is very easy to, you know, bring the ends of both together. But then we have to be careful while ligating the GDA in the initial process of dissection, that we must not ligate it, and we must preserve the GDA contemplating a future reconstruction. And another is end-to-end, of course, but in hepatic artery, common hepatic artery, end-to-end is possible because of its tortuous course. But sometimes, not very often, but there is another option of using a splenic artery by disconnecting it from the main course and transpositioning it to anastomose it to the end of hepatic artery proper.
Right. So if there are any questions from the house, I mean, we can have a discussion on that. But otherwise, I feel we have covered the topic in great detail. The initial talk by Professor Srikhande was very elaborate and very lucid, and we have discussed few more practical points. So most of the points I think are clarified on this. If there are any other questions from the house, we would be happy to take it. If not, I think we can bring curtains to this session. Thank you.
I think
everyone.
we must congratulate Dr. Asit and Dr. Nikhil for so nice conduction, and I learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asit, Dr. Nikhil, and all the team members, Dr. Kishore, Dr. Dipanjan, Dr. Mitra. Thank you so much for having this wonderful interaction and for inviting me here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Dr. Khande has already left, and so is Dr. Mitra. And I thank everyone who participated and everyone who logged in to listen to this talk. Thank you so much for sparing such valuable time from your busy schedules, and thank you all.
Yeah, and there are a couple of questions in the chat box, but I am not taking them up. We can discuss them later. And next webisode is on metastatic pancreatic cancer. So this will be more of interest to the oncologist, the medical oncologist. And with this, I think we can conclude the session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kishore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Dr.
And especially the students who joined in. Thank you all.